Hi, my name is Kaitlyn Mitchum, and I'm a first semester senior at Blackburn College, majoring in legal studies and organizational leadership in the public sector. Today, I'll be speaking on the impact of basic training on the excessive use of force by police officers. After I started this research paper, I started wondering about how it all starts for a police officer. I asked myself, at what point does a police officer make the conscious choice to take someone's life? And not only that, but what training, if any, provoked the police officer to use that type of force? You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. These are our Miranda rights. It is typical for someone to be read these rights the moments before and during their initial arrest. However, some don't get to live to hear these words. On May 25th in 2020 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, an unarmed African-American male, George Floyd, was murdered as a direct result of an excessive use of force by the Minneapolis Police Department. While this tragic murder has taken headlines, there are several more instances alike. According to the Washington Post, as of September 17, 2020, there have been exactly 1,016 individuals killed by the police in this past year alone. Historically, law enforcement officers are trained when and how to use force in police academy training. This training is what aids in the forming and shaping of police officers into what they will be like on the job. That is what I'm here to speak about today: the impact of basic training on the excessive use of force by police officers. My question is, do stricter police training requirements in law enforcement result in less instances of excessive use of force? This is a major and relevant problem that is occurring in every state and with increasing levels of public protest and demands for justice right here and right now. We've seen this in the ongoing Black Lives Matter, Defund the Police, Say Their Names movements, along with several others. This is a relevant topic to everyone, and this affects everyone. What do we already know? In my research, I have defined excessive use of force as, for instance, when a police officer shoots an unarmed man in the back without reasonableness or unlawful assault. This brings us to the first thing we know about Graham v. Connor. In short, this is a case where the police misinterpreted a rush to counter an insulin reaction into a convenience store as a robbery. Graham was a diabetic, and the police simply didn't care, even when identification was trying to be shown. Graham didn't get out of the situation until after he had passed out and sustained a broken foot. Graham filed charges against Connor and the other officers in the city of Charlotte, alleging a violation of his rights by the excessive use of force by the police officers. In this court, in this landmark case, they held that an excessive use of force can only be determined by the objective reasonableness standard. This standard begs the question as to whether a reasonable police officer would have responded in the same manner. In several instances, what a reasonable police officer would have done is based on the use of force continuum, which is a flowchart outlining the steps an officer should take in order to neutralize the situation. As you can see, the very first step is presence and verbal communication, and the very last occurrence on the continuum is deadly force. That is why it is such an important topic, with exactly 1,016 individuals killed by police this year alone. The third and fourth point in my literature review was that police officers are biased in policing and disproportionately use force towards African Americans. In the US, race matters when law enforcement comes in contact with an individual. For example, Floyd v. City of New York, which challenged the New York Police Department's practices of racial profiling and unconstitutional stop and frisk of New York City residents. Between January of 2004 and June of 2012, the NYPD made 4.4 million stops, and over 80% of those 4.4 million stops were African Americans or Hispanics. Part of the holding was that police officers must have a reasonable suspicion, as well as conduct the stop and frisk in a racially neutral manner. This is just one example of how police officers have been biased in their policing, and that force has been used disproportionately towards African Americans. The two are such prominent issues in society that we have the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the nation's original and largest social justice advocacy organization. On October 24th in 2017, the NAACP released a statement of travel advisory and warnings for people of color booking and boarding flights for American Airlines. And this is not the only instance of a travel advisory that has been released for people of color, sometimes for crossing interstate borders. Police training is also a huge topic in and of itself. And while there is no set national standard of what training should be, there is a general setup for what the first parts look like. The first step in becoming a police officer is to find a job posting, fill out an application, and submit your resume. Following, you'll have to pass a written test and then attend an oral board interview. Finally, you'll have a physical agility test, a polygraph test, a psychological exam, and a background investigation. If all of that goes well, then you'll be offered a job and sent to police academy. It's notable that not all police officers are trained at the academy before being given the authorities and privileges that trained police officer might get. In several states, incoming police officers can defer their training for a specific period of time while taking the role of a trained police officer. Major life events are usually reasons training gets deferred. For example, a death in the family, natural disaster, college, or a pandemic. Having trainings are a form of organizational leadership, and by having things like de-escalation training. This leadership falls into ethical leadership because law enforcement is given a privileged place in society and a sort of ethical duty to serve and protect. The major question is, how are they upholding that? And is this use of excessive use of force an example of a failure in ethical leadership? To break that down, I took a look at a concept in ethical leadership called the toxic triangle. If you look at the toxic triangle, it looks at characteristics of destructive leadership, susceptible followers, and the conductive environments which you end up getting in unethical leadership. This shows a good illustration of a failure of ethical leadership, especially when there is low training because it creates a fellowship where the training itself is seen as not as important. That is supported by destructive leaders. One example of this is Dave Grossman, a retired Army Ranger who has been teaching his classes for more than 2 decades. He teaches a class called Bulletproof Mind, which teaches law enforcement agencies across the United States militarized tactics in which officers are told to see themselves as at war on the streets. He focuses on a concept he's dubbed as killology, or the study of killing, and uses it to teach officers to kill with less hesitation. This teaches officers in classes that the most important thing is protecting their own life and knowing when to fire their weapon, not looking at being a police officer as being there to serve and neutralize the situation coming to a resolution. This is destructive because he teaches them the mentality of kill or be killed and persuades them that they aren't going to be a good cop unless they come into the room ready to kill someone. Meaning, if you aren't ready to take a life, just don't be a cop. That creates a conducive environment where there is a lack of checks and balances. Together, I organized my points into a conceptual framework where all of these points influence excessive use of force. In fact, the major concept in every key point is directly related to an excessive use of force. Graham v. Connor, the use of force continuum, law enforcement training, de-escalation requirements, disproportionate excessive use of force towards African Americans, the toxic triangle, and deferred training. What did I find? Well, I did a cross-sectional, non-experimental research design, which involved looking at data collected from the 3 largest databases on police murders in the US, fatalencounters.org, the US Police Shootings Database, and killedbypolice.net, as well as each US state council in charge of police training regulations from the years 2013 to 2019. I found that the average number of basic training days for each state is 81 basic training days at the academy, the lowest being in Louisiana with only 45 basic training days required, and the highest being in Hawaii with 139 basic training days required. And then I took a look at the in-service hours required, which is basically on-the-job training, which could be anything from like firearms requalifications. And I found that the average number of hours for in-service per year is 22. The lowest was in Hawaii and New Jersey, and with 0 hours required for in-service, and the highest was in 10 states with 40 hours required per year. Then I take a look at deferred training from the criminal justice training reform and found that it can be anywhere from none to any. That means 15 states don't allow any deferred training, and North Dakota, Missouri, and Kansas allow as much deferral as needed. I was also able to find each state's de-escalation requirements and found that there are only 10 states that require it, and the most required de-escalation is 4 hours per year, and that's in Massachusetts. After that, I pulled data collected from a database titled Mapping Police Violence. It's notable that it's likely my data results are actually lower than reality because police departments are not required to report excessive use of force instances, but I do believe my numbers are the most accurate numbers available. I found that the number of people killed from 2013 to 2019 was 7,600 total. The lowest state was Rhode Island, responsible for 0.08% of those killings, and the highest state was California, responsible for 15.51% of the total killings by police officers. Out of the total number of individuals killed, I was also able to record the state population for each state, as well as the percentage of African Americans in each state. With that, I was able to calculate the difference in African Americans killed out of the total state percentage of African Americans. I took the percent of African Americans killed for each state and subtracted that from African American population percentage. The results closer to 0 showed more of a neutral amount of excessive use of force towards African Americans and Caucasians. The negative results showed that there was more of a disproportionate excessive use of force towards Caucasians, and positive results showed more of a disproportionate use of force towards African Americans. I found that 5 states were negative, North Dakota being the most significant at negative 3%. 1 state sat at 0, and that was Montana, who also had a 0% population of African Americans. And 44 states sat at positive numbers, Rhode Island being the most significant at 44%. And I think it's also notable to say that Illinois followed closely behind at 39%. I also found how many high-profile police shootings there were from 2013 to 2020 in each state. I defined high-profile police shootings as shootings committed by police that has attracted a major amount of publicity and reaction from society. These included shootings of individuals such as Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, and Breonna Taylor. I found that the top state with the most high-profile police shootings were California with 5 high-profile shootings. I then came up with 4 hypotheses and found the results. My first being, do states with higher instances of excessive use of force also see an increase in the number of high-profile shootings? I used a regressional analysis to show the correlation between the two and found that the answer is yes, and significantly. As the percent of killings per state out of the total killings in the US went up, the number of high-profile police shootings also went up. The graph shows California on the right side with 1,179 police killings and 5 high-profile police shootings. The lowest state shown on the left is Rhode Island with only 6 police killings. My second hypothesis was, do states with higher basic training day requirements have lower excessive use of force instances? I did a regressional analysis and found that yes, it does, and significantly. The states with the least percentage of killings out of the total killings had more basic training days. My third hypothesis was, do states with higher de-escalation requirements see less excessive use of force instances? I did a regressional analysis, and the answer is yes, just not significantly. For the most part, states who had more police killings required less de-escalation requirements. My fourth hypothesis was, do states with higher difference in African American killings for their state population also have a higher number of police shootings? I did a regressional analysis, and the answer is yes, just not significantly. As the difference went up, the number of high-profile shootings went up also, just not significantly. So what? Back to my research question. Do stricter police training requirements and law enforcement result in less instances of excessive use of force? The answer is yes, a little bit. Evidence shows it's having some impact, but it's not really clear-cut, and it needs to be looked further into. If I had to do this research over again or add to it, I would look more into when de-escalation training came into effect for each state. I also think that collecting data on what states have actually changed after each high-profile shooting would be interesting and useful. There are huge changes in police training that could be beneficial to everyone to lower the current issues. I also believe there should be more accountability and regulation on current deferred training rules and procedures. My findings and data tells us that the effectiveness of the leadership who demand these trainings is inconclusive. Because of that alone, I would recommend that we need more leadership and training and attention for those who are in charge of trainings to emphasize the importance of ongoing training and to educate them on the cycle of unethical leadership they are perpetuating. Overall, we need to hold police officers more accountable for their actions and hold those in charge of training police officers more accountable. Thank you, and does anybody have any questions?